What I'm really going to talk about today is IoT security, particularly security of devices, through the eyes of the hackers who hack these devices. And we're going to do this to try to get an understanding of what methods and procedures they use that allow them to breach and exploit some of the most secure devices in the world, devices manufactured by companies with mature security programs and practices, and also draw some insight about a different approach to dealing with these. I'll start with a saying that is topical. It goes like this. If you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. Okay, obviously God is not here because nobody's laughing. But there is, or there should be, a companion saying that goes with that, which is that if you want to make a hacker laugh, tell him your controls. And so let's watch a hacker laugh behind it. And so our question is, what are the enablers of this? Why are they able to do this with great companies and great protections? And one of the enablers is just the nature of the IoT, Internet of Things itself. Some people say it's an engine of digital transformation. Others say it's an engine of the fastest growing attack surface since the invention of computing. Both are probably right. We can see that with some of the statistics, some of the data, which is that 4 billion devices are being added to the 30 billion in circulation and in use already. That has the attention of attackers who attack them about 1.5 billion times. That's in 6 months, about 3 billion times a year. And also the attention of defenders who are spending a little over $1 trillion a year trying to protect themselves from these attacks. The attacks have different purposes. Sometimes it's just to get entry into an enterprise. Sometimes it's to attack a particular device. But one thing is absolutely certain, which is that the number of devices, the number of vulnerabilities on the devices, in the context of this conversation around exploitation and vulnerabilities, the number of attacks is going to double and triple and quadruple long before that $1 trillion for combating it does. Another element that we can think of as an enabler is the fact that IoT devices are fiendishly difficult to protect and to observe. If we think about security from the angle of a PC or a server, most PCs and most servers look a lot like other PCs and servers. That's completely the opposite in the Internet of Things. Most Internet of Things devices look completely different from all other Internet of Things devices. So we saw some examples in the previous presentation of PLCs. There are many other kinds of devices that we can think of, industrial controllers, smart beds, building management and control systems, all with different hardware, different software, different operating systems, very diverse. The second aspect of this that makes things complex and difficult is the presence of third-party dependencies. Every device is an ecosystem of different chips, different processors, different software, from the operating system to the communication protocols to the encryption libraries, all of which also host vulnerabilities that are attackable. And then the third is that these devices have limited resources. And if you take all of this together, what you run into is the fact that there really is no common denominator that allows protection across all of these different kinds of devices. In a nutshell, there's no CrowdStrike for the Internet of Things. And then there's the vulnerabilities themselves. It certainly looks like the Internet of Things is a hive of vulnerabilities. We know that about 2,000 new CVEs are classified every month. Those are the ones that are classified. That doesn't exhaust all of the vulnerabilities that are actually present. And in fact, the emergence of CVEs is regular enough that it's been ritualized into something that we call Patch Tuesday. IT's least favorite day of the week. The other thing, though, about this ritual is that it's honored more in the breach than in the observance, and we can see that when we take a look at companies, almost 60% of whom have devices with known vulnerabilities and known exploits for those vulnerabilities. And then every new device has code. Every 1,000 lines of code has about 15 vulnerabilities in it. So it's easy enough to see why an attacker would think of vulnerabilities as a renewable resource for them. And attack vectors are in ample supply too for attackers. If you're an attacker, if you're a hacker, if you take a look at an IoT system, you see networks and network vulnerabilities. Networks communicate through protocols or sometimes in a double hop through a mobile application with a device. The device, as we noted earlier, is made up of multiple, an ecosystem of different components with their own softwares and their own vulnerabilities. And what attackers do is look for an interaction between the device, or really the protocol on the device, and the network. And when the protocol starts parsing packets, attackers view that as a window of opportunity and exploit that in order to find and exploit a vulnerability and take control of the device. So lots of ways for attackers to exploit devices. And finally, there are the current approaches to protecting devices from exploitation. And the three broad characteristics of the approaches are that they're reactive. In other words, they take place after there's some knowledge of an exploit or a situation that needs to be resolved. Many of them are maladaptive. There's been an effort to take strategies and technologies that work in the PC world, work in the server world, and apply them to the IoT world, and they don't work very well. The resource limitations are a good example. And many are fractional. They're point solutions. They may solve one problem, but they may not address root causes, particularly in the case of exploitation of vulnerabilities at runtime. And so one of the controls, one of the strategies that's most prominent is patching. That's obviously reactive, but it also is severely limited because by definition it doesn't help with 0 days. Another control that's widely used is cryptographic methods. Other techniques such as logical or physical separation of components on devices are also used. But as Adi Shamir said, and he should know, there are a lot better and a lot easier ways to exploit a device than to crack the encryption. And then static analysis is fine. It's even an important thing to do, but it only captures about 50% of vulnerabilities, leaving the other 50% exposed. So the net is that the current approaches may all be necessary. There's certainly no reason to criticize any of these, but they're also insufficient from the perspective of stopping runtime exploitation of vulnerabilities. So what do we do about this? Well, one thing that we can acknowledge is that a vulnerability all by itself really isn't a threat. Unless it's exploited, it really can't hurt you. And the second is that while there are so many vulnerabilities of so many kinds, and it's difficult, probably impossible to clean all of them up or address all of them, one of the things that we can do is that we can fight the exploits. If we shift left and deal with the exploits, we can have a significant impact on exploitation of vulnerabilities. So if you find a hacker and you ask him what an exploit is, again, looking at this problem from through the eyes of the attacker, what he might tell you is, look, an exploit is some tool or technique that I use. It's embodied in a little bit of software. And what I do is I take that and I find a weakness in some software, and I take advantage of it using my exploit and get that software to do something that the designer of the software never intended for it to do. It could be something really bad, something innocuous, but it's basically violating the integrity of the software and getting it to misbehave. And this is an example. It's a play that has been run many times and will continue to be run many times in the future. In this example, we have a buffer with a software flaw in it, with a vulnerability in it. the attacker overflows the buffer. Overflowing the buffer allows him to corrupt memory. Corrupting memory allows him to change an address and run his malicious code in the address and take control of the device. So all of this takes place because the devices tend not to be instrumented in the Internet of Things. Nobody knows about it, and the attack can persist and be present for years before anybody knows anything about it. But there are techniques, there are technologies for dealing with this. And while it's true that vulnerabilities are different, exploits have certain characteristics in common. Characteristics that are immutable, essentially timeless, and unmistakable. If we think about the example I just showed you with the buffer overflow, a buffer overflow will be a buffer overflow will be a buffer overflow from now to the end of time. Its essential DNA is not going to change. The same is true of other kinds of exploitations. For example, manipulating the execution flow of a program, starting a function in the middle, will be the same from now to the end of time. And what works for defenders is the fact that these immutable characteristics can be expressed as a fingerprint. That fingerprint can be detected at runtime, and as a result of that detection, the exploitation can be stopped before it ever has a chance to take advantage of the vulnerability. So that's good news to start with, which is that there's a way of detecting an exploit in process and preventing it from leveraging a vulnerability. The second is that exploitation is an unavoidable step for an attacker. There's no way for an attacker to get the kind of control that we showed earlier without exploiting a vulnerability. One of the ways that I sometimes describe this is that the exploit is a bridge between the malintent of the hacker and that address that we saw in the previous example. If the attacker can cross that bridge, they get to the treasure on the other side. If they can't, there's no other way for them. To get there, and the attack stops. And so, what this does is generalizes to a product, the product of our company, Sternum, which does a number of different things. The first is that it protects against a full range of different kinds of exploits. So the exploit I showed you is a buffer overflow, could apply to the heap, could apply to the stack, but other kinds of attacks like return-oriented programming or use after free or improper input validation, the list is quite lengthy, also have their unique characteristics, also can be expressed as a fingerprint, and also can be prevented deterministically and autonomously. Deterministically means without any dependencies. Autonomously means without any network connection or without any updates. And what's happening under the covers, as a matter of general interest, is that this product, this technology, is inspecting function calls at runtime. And if that function call has those characteristics, has that fingerprint, then the function is not allowed to run. And one of the interesting things, so theories and technology have two things in common. One of which is that they should be retrodictive. They should work in the past too. So if we take the technology that I just showed you, which is known as embedded integrity verification, and apply it to the exploit that we saw before, the exploit, the Stack Overflow exploit, the same exploit, same vulnerability, run against that same Cisco router, but with Sternum installed on it, will be stopped. That exploit will be prevented. The device will be safe. The only things that will happen is that a notification will go to either the manufacturer or the user, whoever is the recipient of the telemetry, letting them know that there was an attack, the attack was prevented, and providing them with the forensics on the attack. Which brings us to the conclusion. One of the things embedded integrity verification does for the Internet of Things and for manufacturers of Internet of Things devices is allow them to bring the benefits of concepts that all of us are familiar with, RASP and control flow integrity and intrusion protection and EDR to the internet. So it brings these benefits to Internet of Things devices, but it doesn't bring the overhead. The overhead of this is under 3%. And some of the outcomes, some of the changes in outcomes include full instrumentation of devices along with instantiation of security and observability. It includes a mechanism for taking much of the pressure and much of, off of patching and much of the pain out of patching. It includes a mechanism for protecting the integrity of devices and for implementing a sustainable and a scalable way to future-proof devices against known and unknown exploits of known and unknown vulnerabilities. This was enjoyable to talk about. That's the end. I was expecting riotous applause. I didn't get it.